my mother's family arrived in Palestine 1920, 1924. So they were in Israel well before the Holocaust. My father, in contrast, escaped from Vienna. Probably in about 37 he arrived in Palestine. How? As an illegal migrant. He read an advertisement that a group of pilgrims, Christian preachers, are going to the Holy Land. So he pretended to be one of them, and that's how he arrived in Israel. Just to give it some light touch, every morning and every night he was waiting for the guy who shared his cabin to leave the cabin so he could put tefillin on, until he discovered the other guy was a Jew too. So anyhow, that's how he arrived and jumped.
And he was a religious practicing Jew at that
My
time.
father, he was a bit, unlike my mother and her family that were anti-religious, very avid they were religiously anti-religious, as HaShomer HaTzair was. But coming back, so that's how my father arrives in Palestine. One of the first things that he does is he starts saving as much money as he can. And with that money, part of it, he then pays a Jew in Palestine to go to Vienna to marry his sister fictitiously. And that's how he saves her. But what I knew was, and I don't know how I knew, my memory of my father was that he was walking up and down the corridor in our small apartment in Tel Aviv with terrible abdominal pain that were supposed to be ulcers. But I always knew that what really tortured him was the thought that his parents were murdered during the Holocaust. As an adult, I started thinking, how did I know? And I still don't know how. But what I do know is this, that years and years later, my cousin one day brings me a letter that my father wrote shortly before he died to his sister in Australia, written in German, in which he writes to her and he says, every time I'm in a lot of pain, but I'm comforted by the thought that now I'm suffering like our parents suffer. Children know a lot without knowing how they know. They know, and I did know too. Now, I think maybe I should say that, because I think it's central to my thinking about the Holocaust. When your father dies when you are 10, you put a pink color glasses to look. And I romanticized, but I remember him as with great affection, with love, with warmth, etc. But there is the other side. And the other side was, I realized that I was also ashamed of him. What was I ashamed of? He died in 49. The War of Independence started in 47. He did not go to war. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't tough. He wasn't strong. He did not speak Hebrew. The few words were terrible. He was a softy. He wasn't a true Sabra. Now, I was also deeply ashamed of the fact that I was ashamed of him. So I had problems admitting it to myself. And when I admitted to myself, it took me a long time before I could tell others that that's how I felt about him. And it took me many more years to realize that by all probability, he felt the same about himself, and that my mother felt the same about him. And the society in which I grew had that attitude towards him. He was one of those people who would go like lamb to slaughter rather than fight. He wasn't a fighter. And I know that it also shaped the way my attitude to myself, which was I had to hide any softness in me. I served in the army in Israel. You cannot be more fortified. I was in the tank corps. I had 32 tons of steel around me. But what I could not tell anybody was that every so often I was terribly afraid. I was scared. Can I use the word shitless? And I was ashamed of the fact that I was afraid.
There's no room to be afraid, to be frightened. It was a weakness.
You have to be strong, and that is part of the legacy of the Holocaust. Weakness led to death. Other societies had the same attitude, so it's not just the Holocaust, but the Holocaust makes it so much more powerful.
And did you not see in that his amazing ability to get into Palestine as a pilgrim and to have the foresight to save his sister?
Yeah, that's the other side. I loved my father and also admired him. And one of the things that I admired the most, maybe I should add that, was that he had the commitment, put the effort to save his sister in spite of my mother's strenuous objection, because she wanted the little that they had for her poor son and for herself and to whatever. And at the time, as a child, I was totally on my father's side, and I was very condemning of my mother. And only with age, maturity, and reflection that at least I understand where she came from. And one of the things she did not anticipate is the Holocaust. To her, her husband was putting his sister ahead of her and their son's needs. The uncle I loved, the family that I felt the closest was on kibbutz. To be on kibbutz was next to God. I was one of the lucky kids in my class because I had an uncle and an auntie on kibbutz. That was the most prestigious thing that you could do in Israel, was to be on kibbutz. And I was always, all my life I've had shpilkes. So I didn't want to wait till I was 18 to go to kibbutz. There were many other reasons. One of them because my mother was difficult and I was trying to get away from her. And I loved being with other kids. One of the other things about my father's family was he had then a sister in Israel. One sister arrived in Australia, and one brother they didn't know about because he was left in Europe. And I remember my parents' anxiety, or my father particularly, what happened to his brother. But I remember the day. The war is over, 45, so I must be 6. They get a letter from my uncle. In Australia he became Harry. In Vienna he was Hermann. Telling them that he is alive and what happened to him. And I remember my parents in bed. He was a joker. He was writing funny letters. And my parents for hours reading and rereading his letter and pishing themselves, laughing and celebrating his survival, as it were. I'll come back to my father's story later because I want to go to my mother's side story. My My mother's father arrived in Israel in 1920. However, he was a bit of a wanderer, probably a bit unstable and unreliable. So he goes on business to Europe and get caught up in the war there, and is put in the Lodz ghetto, where he's in a queue and he starts protesting about being put in a queue, and the German soldiers beat him to death. This story I knew all along. What I discovered years later is the following, that sometime before it was too late, my grandfather, writes to his daughter, to my mother, and says, I'm out of money, could you help me to come back to Israel, to Palestine? She hasn't got the money. She goes to her beloved brother and says to him, he's on kibbutz, and says, look at this is what our father wrote to me. And he says, he must be kidding. He deserted us, he went away, I'm not going to help him. Probably even if he did want to, he could not have. But they turned their back on him, and they both claim that they felt okay about it. And I always had my doubts. My doubts may tell more about the sort of person I am than anything that they ever said or expressed. But that's the story. So you could see how the complex of real family relationship takes a different color, a different twist, different meaning because of the Holocaust. I never would have talked about it whilst my mother and her brother were alive. I've often wanted to talk about it, but I would not. I talk to my cousins, his children, and they are okay about me talking about it. But you know, they always have this struggle about what is appropriate to be kept private and what's not. So that's part of my story of the family. But let me go on a little bit. The next episode is this. When I am about 16, 17, my mother remarries a man by the name of Shimon Helishkovsky. I liked him very, very much. He related to me with great gentleness, and there was always a sadness that was in the way he related to me. And it took me years to connect it to a very simple fact, namely, he was a musician. And on work, he is in Tehran playing piano when the war breaks out, and his wife and 3 children get murdered in Poland. Probably in Warsaw, if I remember correctly. And I do not know how I know, but I know, and probably I have never talked to him about it. By the way, he then decides to come to Israel and arrives, and the British send him to Cyprus. So he's in Cyprus until he can arrives in Palestine when British mandate finishes. So I'm about to start telling you more about how the Holocaust does not leave me. So that's my stepfather, Shimon. And then my auntie in Australia, my father's sister, Ida Saliki, hears that I've just left the army and that I'm considering studying psychology. And she's very keen. She come to Australia and study here. And she convinces me, and I come to study in Australia. So when I first arrive, I stay with my auntie Ida and her daughter Jenny Saliki Buch. And but one of the things that I find out is by then my auntie's late husband died. However, during the Holocaust, he came here and left behind and lost a wife and 5 children. And my cousin Jenny knows it. But one day she rings me terribly, terribly upset, agitated. What happened? She wants to take out an Australian passport. In order to get the passport, she has to get her birth certificate. She gets the birth certificate, and for the first time in her life, she sees the name of her 5 dead siblings. Because her late father, when she was born, to register her, he says, other children, and he mentioned, name them all. So and the story then continues. I then marry a woman by the name of Tess. Her surname from home was Spat. And I said to her one day, Tessie, what happened to your grandparents? And she said, they died well before the Holocaust. Until one day we meet a man who says to us, I knew your family. He was a distant relation. I met your grandparents in the Warsaw Ghetto. Everywhere I go, the Holocaust is around me. I want to tell you, if I may, the next. What happened? All my life, I tried to avoid speaking German since my father died. And
Was it your first language?
At home, my parents spoke to each other in German. And as soon as I could, I answered in Hebrew, naturally. And I never wanted to go to a German-speaking country. But with the passage of the years, my resolve weakened. And eventually I decided about 10, 15 years ago that to connect more appropriately, more deeply to my father, I should go to Vienna. So I go to Vienna with my late wife, Tess. The first thing that happens is she organized the trip. We arrive at the airport, and the hotel sends a chauffeur-driven car to take us to the hotel. I sit in the car. He's in uniform, sort of rural landscape, and to my utter amazement, I break up and I cry and I can't stop crying. And there's only one thought or experience, not even thinking, on my mind. My father escaped like the thief in the night. My grandparents were murdered. And for me, they sent a chauffeur-driven car. And it was a terrible experience. The next thing I do is we go to the synagogue and I find all sorts of documents about my father's Brit Milah, bris, his bar mitzvah, actually written, my grandparents' marriage registration. But then I go to the other place. Namely, there is a Holocaust, what do they call it? It's an office to keep records. Archive commemoration. I forgot they have a name for it. And I say that I'm here to find out whatever they can provide me, any information they have about my grandparents. And the woman in reception talks to me for a while. Then she says, come with me. And she takes me to another office. And she says to the lady in the other office, this is the grandson of Genya and Jacob Lang. And you know what happened to me then? The first time in my life, probably age in my 60s sometime, the first time ever that I'm a grandson. Nobody has ever referred to me as a grandson. And the shivers were going up and down my spine like nobody's business. It was amazing, totally unanticipated. Next thing that happened, she started looking at the documents and she tells me the following. Your grandmother and your grandfather were transported from Vienna. The date, the day, the car number, the transport number, transported to Theresienstadt. They arrive at Theresienstadt at such and such and such a time. Your grandmother was then sent on such a date, absolutely everything documented, to Auschwitz. She arrives in Auschwitz about 2 weeks before the end of the war, when she's put straight away into the gas chamber. Then she says to me that my grandfather also was transported to Auschwitz. And I said to her, could you check again? I'm pretty sure that that is wrong, because I was told, and I've always believed, that my grandfather died in Theresienstadt 3 months after arrival. She looks through the files, and then she became ashen-faced, and she said to me, I'm so terribly sorry. Why? There were 2 Jacob Lang. One was his cousin, called after the same grandfather as Jews do. He was younger than my grandfather, and he was sent to Auschwitz. My grandfather, as my information. And she was terribly apologetic. And when she apologized to me like that, something happened to me. I realized she was a Viennese woman, probably volunteering. And her apology was a genuine, real human apology. And when I forgave her, I forgave lots of other people and things as it were. I think that's roughly the story of my family. But maybe I want to tell you 1 or 2 other things. The Auntie Ida, who brought me to Australia, arrived in Australia just before the war started. When the war breaks out, she's an alien. She's an enemy alien. So she's required to, she's advised that she has to present herself to the St. Kilda police station. She goes to the police station, and the chief of police says to her, I want you to come. She says, but I can't, I'm working. So he says to her, a young woman like you, why do you have to work so long and so hard? She says, I'm trying to save money to send to my parents. So he says to her, you know what? Once a week, come to my place for dinner. And that always stayed with me as that wonderful symbol of the experience of so many of us, how this country has been so wonderful to all of us, and how the Holocaust has made so many of us so deeply appreciative of it. And that's the other side of the Holocaust to me, that suffering also leads to appreciation. And basically, in my work with survivors, if you have the willingness and the ear for it, you can also hear the depth of appreciation that people have had for life itself and for human kindness. And the other thing is, that would happen to my aunt, but she's typical. She helped me, she helped many other members of her family, and she helped relative strangers. And that's what I think the Holocaust has done. It made many of us much more responsible for each other, caring for each other, and also hate each other much more, because we say the wrong thing, we belong to the wrong party, to the wrong aspect of religion, etc. That's my take on it.